Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. Hello, a warm welcome to today's podcast, episode number 19 of our podcast, Value Impulses. I'm looking forward to talking about self-leadership today, which in my opinion is the eternal first step to getting ahead in life. With self-leadership, not only Robert S. Hartman, many others, and I have dealt with it, but also my good business partner, Dr. Burkhard Benzmann, whom I've known for many years now and with whom I work very, very well. And in the next episode, I'll have him as a guest here for an interview. So, that's just a quick announcement for now. Today, my goal is to make the process behind self-leadership a bit more transparent. Of course, there's a lot of literature on it and it's also really important, yeah. Regardless of whether you're a manager or an employee, yeah. You have to start from within and, well, learn to lead yourself. Because it's about aligning your own actions with your personal values, mindsets, and goals. And I'll dive right into that now. What actually makes self-leadership relevant? Well, in my view, it's a prerequisite for being able to lead other people well. But I don't just see that in the context of work, in the sense of a supervisor leading employees. But we have very different areas of life and ultimately it's always about leading people, accompanying them somewhere, getting them to go in a certain direction. Whether that's in a family context, whether it's among friends or acquaintances, getting someone excited about something. Maybe getting someone to tackle something together, and of course, in professional life too. And it's often the case that functional leadership, without disciplinary responsibility, is much more demanding in my opinion because you just don't have the epaulets and insignia of power. But you have to convince people, inspire them, fire them up, get them to take the path you suggest or want to take. And then, of course, we have many different areas in society where we lead, not always necessarily as a manager. And then politics comes into it too, of course. Just because many politicians set such a bad example for us doesn't mean that we don't need politics, right? Every human organization needs politics in the sense that there must be a balance of interests, that majorities are generated. And all of that has to do with leadership, and yes, it starts right there with self-leadership. And ultimately, it's the ability to shape your own development, to increase motivation, to clarify goals, and so on. And this motive of shaping things is something very important. And in this context, I like to refer to the psychological pattern of the internal locus of control, meaning that I have the fundamental conviction that I have within me. Yes, something inside that, when brought to the outside, can shape things, yes, which I can control myself, and with that, I can change my environmental conditions. That is very, very important in self-leadership and, of course, in other forms of leadership, to have this conviction, I am capable and can actively shape my life. And if we look at society, in many places, this conviction is just not there. There, the so-called external locus of control prevails, meaning the conditions that exist. They control me, and I am, so to speak, at their mercy, right? And if you have this fundamental conviction, well, then at the end of the day, you are being lived, yes, expressed passively, so to speak. And we want to live through self-leadership from within ourselves. That's why this internal locus of control, as opposed to the external locus of control, is very important to me. Of course, we can't always shape everything. Of course, there are framework conditions, there are laws and so on, but I believe that in our society, we could use a significant portion more of people who really believe in this internal locus of control and take their lives into their own hands accordingly. So, the self, when we talk about self-leadership, is of course central. And how is the self structured? Yes, and how can I, so to speak, get the best out of it? And according to Hartman, a good person is the one who fulfills their concept. And of course, it's important to find out what that is, what is inside me, so to speak, what are perhaps my life goals, what are, yes, my potentials, how do I recognize them, how can I use them? Yes, and Hartman also expressed this quite drastically once and said, yes, only about 90%, or about 90% of people in society, they merely live in their roles. Yes, only 10% actually use their full potential. And that would also be one of my life goals, to say, man, why can't we expand this percentage? Why? Or how can we contribute to more people taking their destiny, their potentials, into their own hands? And the common problem we have there is that people aren't clear about themselves and their abilities and how they work together. And then, of course, they also fail at the subsequent steps. And in my book, Key Factor, Value-Based Leadership, I dedicated a chapter to self-leadership. And you can read more about it there. I'll now go into some of the aspects that I've developed there. If you want to find the book, it's easy on Amazon, Ulrich Vogel, and then Key Factor Value-Based Leadership. And then it's quite easy to find. I'll touch on Hartman and how he views self-leadership. And for those of you listening to the podcast for the first time, Hartman developed 3 dimensions of value. First, the human one, which I like to express through the heart. So that's the feeling, the emotions we have, but also things we're capable of, like love, self-awareness, inspiration, creativity. And in his view, the human value dimension is the most valuable. Then we also have the practical value dimension, well expressed by the hand. What we perceive, observe, what we make, what we do, what we can make work with our hands is very, very important for our survival. And finally, the third value dimension, Hartman calls it systemic. I usually call it the fundamental value dimension. This is where we use our reason, where we use our head, our intellect, and abstract what might lie behind things and feelings. What laws exist, and how I can recognize them and make them useful. And as I dive into value-based self-leadership, I'll start with the heart. So the question is, what are my actual desires, so to speak? What do I want to experience on an experiential level in my life? And what don't I? What do I want to do in my life? To make, to achieve, and what not to? And what might I want to achieve when I look at the doing and the experiencing? From a long-term perspective, what should happen in my life and what shouldn't? In my book, I called them the experiential level, the action level, and the planning and control level, which I'm trying to systematize here, starting from my heart's desires and the human value dimension. To systematize how I can proceed here, experience, what's a yes, what's a no, doing, action, what's a yes, what's a no, planning, control, what's a yes, what's a no, and that way I can, to a large extent, well, vet my desires and also collect them and, well, refine them. And besides these desires that I have, so to speak, in the human value dimension, in the heart area of my self-leadership. It's also about my values, of course, so what's actually important to me in life? And there are, of course, various methods to work that out. We also developed a corresponding values database and a worksheet for it, which you can also download from my book using a QR code if you like. But at this point, I'd like to briefly share personally what are my 12 personal values. In my case, it turned out to be 12. And what does that mean to me? Well, my first and, in terms of order, most important, most precious value, so to speak, is love and family. Yeah, so my wife, my 5 children, they are my top priority. And I'm probably not alone in society in that regard. It's surely the same for many. My second most important value, I call it humanity, compassion, and empathy. That's perhaps expressed a bit more fully with those 3 words. And when other people are doing poorly, for example, I feel it right in the pit of my stomach. Yeah, I get a sinking feeling. Yeah, and when things happen without humanity, then I'm just irritated and I'm gone very, very quickly. Yeah, that's why it's very important to me, humanity, compassion, and empathy. My third value is freedom and independence. Yeah, I was an employee for 14 years and have now been self-employed for 15 years. I think I'll probably stay that way for the rest of my life. The fourth value for me is optimism. Yeah, I think I got that from my mother. I see an opportunity in every difficulty, frustration. Never lasts longer than a few hours. Of course, there's frustration sometimes. There are also very, very difficult life situations. But I'm very, very glad that this optimism is planted within me. The fifth point for me is the joy of making decisions. Yeah, I really like doing that, or rather, I feel quite uncomfortable if I don't decide. Yeah, I want to get whatever's pending off the table as quickly as possible. Yeah, and then I stick to the old entrepreneurial rule, out of 20 decisions, 5 can easily be wrong. Yeah, that's better than if 20 decisions hadn't been made at all. And that's how opportunities just pass you by. That's why the joy of making decisions is an important value for me. The sixth point for me is creativity. So having to always do the same thing, just going through the motions, always giving the same seminars or something, that would be a nightmare for me. That would be a nightmare for me. Yeah, I need variety. I want to create. Yeah, so that's why creativity for me is also variety. Something new is part of it. My seventh value is enthusiasm. So, I go by the old saying, shared joy is double joy and shared sorrow is half sorrow. So when we're inspired, when we're emotionally fired up, yeah, then motivation and creative power follow, yeah. So a shared enthusiasm can really let something truly great emerge. My eighth value is generosity. Yeah, that's what people say about me. And indeed, I love inviting other people over. I've always done that, but of course it can also be a weakness and you can be taken advantage of. But I think, as long as you don't give too much on a large scale, it's happened to me too in the wrong place. It's actually a nice value, I think, and important to me. The ninth value for me is trust. I give plenty of it up front, knowing full well that disappointments can sometimes follow. And because of that, I mustn't become bitter, but I have to give again, especially as a leader. And every now and then I trust too much or expect too much of others, which can potentially lead to them being overwhelmed. So I have to be a bit careful with myself there. My 10th value is effectiveness and competence. So I want to do the right thing, so what leads to the goal? Yeah. And the discussions about details, they can really, really drive me crazy when it's really about the finest efficiencies in the end. And some people, they also do the wrong thing highly efficiently at the end of the day. So what isn't effective? That's why effectiveness is important and competence too. So what I can't stand are clueless people who nonetheless act with confidence. Confidence. My 11th value finally is team spirit. I can also work alone, but it always has to contribute to a bigger picture that we as a whole team are ultimately aiming for. So working together is, simply fun for me. And 12th point, finally, open-mindedness and openness. I'm very curious and eager to learn. That has to do with creativity. That was my 6th value. Here too, but I do differentiate it a bit. Other opinions and arguments, they just fuel my own thoughts, yeah. So for me, standstill means both boredom and regression. So, those were the two aspects in the heart area where I spent a bit more time, my wishes and my values. So that's, one part, I would say, of the value framework. The second part then isn't the wish, but the concept that I actually develop of myself. And with that, we're in the head, in the brain area, in the ratio, in the systemics, in the fundamental dimension of values, and that's where we need to develop a vision. And Hartman has two very, very beautiful things here in Freedom to Live, or, as translated and published by me, Freiheit zu Leben, also available on Amazon, the Robert Hartman story, 2 sets of 4 steps/questions that he's laid out or developed, which I think can guide you very, very well if you work through them. And the first one is the 4 steps, as he says, know yourself. That means listening to yourself, looking inside, where am I really, really good? Where are my talents, my potentials? And where are they not? So you don't approach it unrealistically. Everyone has a unique set of talents, and to dive into that and recognize it, to really examine it, is step 1. Step 2 is then to actually accept it. That means saying, yes, this is it, I accept it now, and I'll make the best of it. Many struggle with themselves, saying, because I'm like this or that, this and that won't work, and so on. And then you're actually standing in your own way. That's why I find this second one, accept yourself, incredibly important, because it's the internal starting signal to get going. And the third is build yourself. Create yourself in English, so actually developing yourself and never stopping, but rather, yes, I find this building of the self a very, very nice term. In English, Hartman also says constructive self. So that's directly connected to building, actually. And finally, give yourself to others, give yourself. That's where many stop and say, well, I'm fully developed now, everything is wonderful. But where did we all get to start? We stand on the shoulders of giants, of millions, billions of people who brought us this far so that we could actually start there. And that's why it's important, when you're building, always of yourself. To always remember to give, to pass it on to others. And the older I get, the more joy it actually gives me to see that, passing on experiences, helping people gain insight so they can grow accordingly. So, know yourself, accept yourself, build yourself, and give yourself back to society. That's a 4-step process from Hartman. And the second 4-step process consists of 4 questions that are also very nicely in his book Freiheit zu Leben. Are also listed. The first question is, what am I on this earth for? Right, and not just to check it off like some Sunday school lesson, just to earn money or to pursue my mission without having any clue what that even is. So, what am I on this earth for? And that's something I'm still working on, which I think is allowed, but I've already established a personal mission statement that I'm constantly refining. So this basic question, what am I meant for, as Boris Grundle always puts it so well, finding the deeper meaning of one's existence, one's own unique existence, each of us is unique. to ask this question here and to try to answer it. And the second question from Hartman then becomes very specific. Why do I work for this or that organization, for this or that company? And that's important, right, because it has to contribute to my purpose in life. Look, for the longest part of our professional lives, of our waking hours, well, when we're awake, we're at work. And that's why it's incredibly important that this ultimately aligns with the purpose in life I tried to answer in the first question. Right, so what for? Why do I work for this company? It's very important to think that through. And well, now the third question is a bit surprising, but if you look closer, I think it's very, very brilliant. How can this company, this organization, contribute to fulfilling my purpose in life? Right, so Hartman explained regarding this question, if I may quote, "The company I work for exists for me." Yes, an organization can never stand above an individual because it doesn't live itself and therefore doesn't possess the human dimension of values. Thus, the company I work for becomes an instrument for fulfilling my life goals, not just mine, of course, but others too, a continuation, so to speak, of my inner self, just as my body and mind are. Right, so my work must nourish myself so that it can grow and develop. Yes, it should inspire me, the work, strengthen my mental powers and my entire life force, end of quote. So, it must be said again, companies are there for people and not people for companies. And in that sense, if you think more deeply about it, this third point is really, truly important. And the fourth question after that, once you know how this company, this organization can contribute to fulfilling your own purpose in life, you logically ask, how can I now help this company, this organization to realize my purpose in life? Well, by truly putting in all my effort. I use my strength. And we all know from all kinds of surveys that many people only use, 60, maybe 50, maybe only 40% of their strength and potential for their company. And that's where I think the great reserves in society lie, so that we can say, yes, if we manage to get people to want to use 100% of all their potential, then we'll really get somewhere. And for me, that's the deeper meaning of these four questions. So that's the target image for moving forward quickly, if we adopt a systemic, fundamental value dimension in self-leadership. And then, of course, there are also the roles that we have accordingly in our lives. I developed the concept of the life car there, maybe in more detail another time. Let's go back and summarize so that we can move on to the realization of the value framework. So the desire and the values, the hard side, plus the concept, my target image and the roles, the head side, that's my value framework. And now it's about the realization, with my hands. Yes, what am I doing? How do I prioritize my time? Which is finite, after all, and extremely valuable. Yes, and many know the Eisenhower matrix with important and urgent, and also Stephen Covey with a similar concept. I'm doing it here with valuable/worthless and planned and unplanned. And proceeding accordingly in this matrix is something very essential for me in value-based self-leadership. And then, of course, there's also something like what, when, how, for what. I then have to control the activities, if you will. And that's why I have to actually realize the time in comparison with my value framework, in comparison with my values, desires, and precisely with my concept, i.e. target image and roles, actually realize it. And this is also about my own development, which, by the way, can be realized very well with the value matrix, as I have often explained. And then, precisely, which focus I actually take. I like to refer to Jim Collins with his hedgehog concept, how you can sharpen what the activity actually is, how you develop the passion for it, and how you also turn it into an economic engine. But that would go too far, at this point. Anyone who wants to have self-leadership at a glance in the graphic that I've tried to convey here in the podcast should go to page 85, in my book and can then take a look at it there accordingly. That's page 86. I just see. So, let's get back, to the next episode, which I'd like to announce here, namely, Burkhard Benzmann. Burkhard is a management consultant, honorary professor, and author, and he's here for leadership development. 21. His academy is active in that field and has developed self-leadership as a very important concept. I find his background very interesting because he has a background in art history, literature, and philosophy. But he also understands a lot about technical things. I'm able to give a bit of a preview here now. And I'm also looking forward to recording our interview with him in a few days. So, thank you very much. This has gone on a bit longer for your valuable time. And I'm already looking forward to the interview with Burkhard and hope that you'll join us often on our podcast, Value Impulses.